All right, you guys, welcome back to another episode of Freedom Papers. This is Morgan Zeggers. I'm a contributor for Turning Point USA and a host of this wonderful educational podcast on the Federalist Papers, the Anti-federalist Papers, basically the documents that made up the ratification debate back in the late 1700s when it started in 1787 when we were deciding should we ratify the U.S. Constitution or not. You know, hint, we ended up ratifying it, and the Federalists won that debate. But that being said, it's really important for us to understand what happened in American history and world history. And so we are going through, thanks to Turning Point USA, all of the Federalist and Anti-Federalist papers. Today is one of my more favorite papers. I'll admit, number 2 is one of my top favorites. 51 and 10 are classics, but today we're going over Federalist paper number 4, and it's something that I really enjoy because I'm a history nerd. And I love to understand the historical context of why certain decisions and arguments were made, especially when we're talking about America's founding. Now, Federalist Paper number 4 was written by John Jay. As you guys know, you should know by now. If you haven't, you got to watch the other episodes of Freedom Papers. John Jay, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton came together as the Federalists to write these documents. They wrote it under the pen name Publius. Federalist Paper number 4, though, was written by John Jay. He wrote papers 2 through 5 that were titled Concerning Dangers from Foreign Force and Influence. Well, that was the name of number 2. And then number 3, 4, 5 were named The Same Subject Continued. Very simple. Simple man. But today, like I said, we're talking about number 4. Before we get into it, though, let's give a quick recap on John Jay because he's quite the man, and a recap on papers number 2 and 3 because we just spoke about those and I want to give you guys the proper context. John Jay, he's kind of a New Yorker, okay? I'm from upstate New York, so I like to relate to this man. But other than being from New York and being a part of all of the history there, John Jay served as the key negotiator at the Treaty of Paris, which ended up ending the American Revolutionary War and recognized the independence of the United States. All right, pretty big deal. I think I've said that before. Pretty big deal. He later served as the first Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court and the second governor of New York State. So, again, pretty big deal. Pretty great guy. Paper number 2, though, let's talk about that one. Like I said, one of my favorites, and that's because it's just beautiful, okay? I love poetry. I love quotes. I have a bunch of Pinterest boards. Paper number 2 is just so beautifully written, and basically he says we're stronger together, okay? We fought this Revolutionary War together. We won together. Why the heck are we even thinking of splitting up in the first place into little states or little confederacies? It's just not right. And what he says, and it's a quote that sticks with me, is he basically says this land and this people seem to have been made for each other. And he says that the American people and the beautiful, fertile land that is America that provided so many opportunities for us to grow this great economy in this great country, we were brought together, and he says it was by providence. So I think that that's beautiful. Moving into number 3, though, paper number 3 is more so about logistics, okay? It's about safety. He says that safety is crucial in a free society. He says there's domestic issues, and we'll talk about those too, but how do we protect ourselves from hostilities from abroad? He says conflict is frequent thanks to humans. I mean, mankind, we have quite the track record throughout history of going to war over what he says are frivolous things. And he's right. I mean, history is a pretty rough tale of mankind. And so he says you cannot stop people from getting into conflicts. You can't stop war. You can't stop people from having disagreements. You can't stop factions, whether they're domestic or foreign conflicts. He says, though, there's ways to limit it. And he believes that the best way to limit the amount of conflicts is to limit the number of groups that are able to even potentially get into conflict. He says that when you have a bunch of little states, or if we have multiple confederacies dealing with all of these nations around us, there's going to be so many more opportunities for us to get into conflict and war. And it would be safer for us if we're all advocating as one united America. We're not only safer because of that, because we're avoiding the number of potential conflicts, but we're also stronger when we are one united force. And so that's what number 3 is really all about. And today, we're getting into paper number 4. So again, it's the same subject continued, but this one has a little bit more to do with how to handle other causes of war, other than just, conflicts and relationship problems between countries and just causes is what he says. So like breaking treaties or upsetting each other. This is more about the more unique situations, and a lot of it is about economic competition and the tensions that can grow from other things that can lead to conflict and war. Some of the discussion points that we're going to go over today. The first one is just addressing and preventing unjust causes of war and what he's talking about when he says that. The second is trade and economic competition will continue to grow our tension with surrounding countries. He says this. He says, so what are we going to do about it? Okay, so we're growing as a nation. Our ability to produce, our economic strength is growing. We're becoming an economic competitor with these nations that have never had to compete with us before. We're taking their economic growth away from them, and that's going to lead to some potential issues. So what should we do about it? The question next is basically, okay, so what's the best way for us to deal with this now? And Publius, the Federalist, they argue that it's best done as one united nation, where we can limit the number of conflicts and we can be stronger when we're at the negotiating table or when we're just trying to put up a strong front against a nation that's going to try and push us back as we start beating them in trade and in economic competition. But the Anti-federalists, the founders that were on the other side of this debate, okay, so they didn't want to have this union formed. They were either in support of the Articles of Confederation or just not in support of changing to the U.S. Constitution that would create a federal government, a union of all of the states. They said that this was not necessary. They said, we're already able to handle our problems. Okay, we don't need it. They thought it was unnecessary, and they, in general, with all of the Anti-Federalist papers, they continue to argue that the creation of a federal government is just going to oppress the American people in the end. So they both bring up great points, and again, we ended up ratifying the U.S. Constitution. So it's interesting to hear these debates going back and forth. Now, what's cool, though, and I'm a history nerd, we're then going to talk about a case study. What Publius does is he brings up Great Britain. He says, what if it was separated? Okay, now apply that same situation of what would happen if Great Britain was separated to us and to our states and what we would look like if we were just a bunch of little confederacies or states trying to protect ourselves and we weren't working together, coordinating and having a strong front together. And so I love that case study that he provides. Now moving on though, you guys, let's get on into the discussions and into the topics, but before I do that, just a friendly reminder, I need you guys to buy your own copies of the Federalist and Anti-Federalist papers. There's a ton of copies out there. There are books out there that also combine the papers so that you can read them one after another because they went at each other directly of like active weekly debates on these subjects. My favorite one, and I hope you guys get this copy, is the Charles Kessler version of the Federalist Papers. So I hope you guys do that. I hope you read these papers and engage with them yourself. Don't just listen to what I have to say about them. This is just my analysis and my overview. So be sure to read on your own as well. Now, getting into it. Topic number 1. So paper number 3 was about handling just causes of war. But this paper will be about other causes of war. Let's see what Publius says. So Publius says, my last paper assigned several reasons for why the safety of the people would be best secured by union against the danger it may be exposed to by just causes of war given to other nations. And those reasons show that such causes would not only be more rarely given, but would also be more easily accommodated by a national government than either by the state governments or the proposed little confederacies. I will say I like that he says little confederacies because I say that too, but I just thought it was my slang. But if Publius says it, then I think I'm justified. So he goes on to say, but the safety of the people of America against dangers from foreign force depends not only on their forbearing to give just causes of war to other nations, but also on their placing and continuing themselves in such a situation as not to invite hostility or insult. For it need not be observed that there are pretended as well as just causes of war. So basically he's saying we need to also protect ourselves from just causes of war and unjust causes of war, and part of that is making sure that we're posturing ourselves in a position of strength. He moves on to say, humans basically go to war over really stupid causes. He says, it is too true, however disgraceful it may be to human nature, that nations in general will make war whenever they have a prospect of getting anything by it. Nay, that absolute monarchs will often make war when their nations are to get nothing by it, but for purposes and objects merely personal, such as a thirst for military glory, revenge for personal affronts, ambition or private compacts to aggrandize or support their particular families or partisans. These and a variety of other motives which affect only the mind of the sovereign often lead him to engage in wars not sanctioned, not sanctified by justice or the voice and interests of his people. Okay, so basically kings, monarchs, people with way too much power, they're selfish and they abuse the power that they have and they put people into war. They bring harm to their people just to go to war for selfish purposes. So then Publius goes on to say, but independent of these inducements to war, which are most prevalent in absolute monarchies, but which well deserve our attention, there are others which affect nations as often as kings, and some of them will on examination be found to grow out of our relative situation and circumstances, and that's really what this paper is about. So it's a preface to the conversation that we're about to have of, okay, so we're not a monarchy, and we can avoid a lot of these unjust causes of war. We can avoid a lot of this selfishness that comes from monarchies that lead to these crazy wars just for military glory or riches. But we still have to keep an eye out for the following potential concerns regarding foreign affairs and potential conflict. And that's when we get into the relationships that America at the time in 1787 has with other countries surrounding it. Publius says, with France and with Britain, we are rivals in the fisheries and can supply their markets cheaper than they can themselves, notwithstanding any efforts to prevent it by bounties on their own or duties on foreign fish. With them and with most other European nations, we are rivals in navigation and the carrying trade, and we shall deceive ourselves if we suppose that any of them cannot increase without in some degree diminishing theirs. It is more their interest and will be more their policy to restrain than to promote it. And so it's kind of basic stuff of we compete with France and Britain now when it comes to selling fish, with navigation, with the carrying trade. Obviously, when we succeed in this market, when we start growing our economy and our ability to produce, it means we're worsening their performance, okay? We're beating them, and we are taking money from them. We are beating them in the markets. And there will be tension between us and them as we compete for success. Makes sense. It's pretty simple. So, he then goes on to say, in the trade to China and India, we interfere with more than one nation, inasmuch as it enables us to partake in advantages which they had in a manner monopolized, and as we thereby supply ourselves with commodities we used to purchase from them. I mean, there again, it's like we're taking trade partners. Not only that, though, we're adding tension between us, France, Britain, because now we're involving all these other countries, China and India. And it's the fact that these guys used to monopolize the markets, and we're saying, hello, we are a new and growing competitor, and we're about to change up the way you've been doing business for quite some time. You no longer have a monopoly. And even more simply, we also used to just get our goods from these other countries, and now, instead of relying on them, we are providing them to ourselves on our own. We're producing them for ourselves, so we don't have to buy them from them anymore. And we're beating them in production and then selling those products in a way that beats them as competitors. And so we're providing it for ourselves. We're no longer customers. We are now growing competitors, and that adds a little tension. So, then Publius goes on to say, the extension of our own commerce and our own vessels cannot give pleasure to any nations who possess territories on or near this continent, because the cheapness and excellence of our productions, added to the circumstance of vicinity, and the enterprise and address of our merchants and navigators, will give us a greater share in the advantages which those territories afford than consists with the wishes or policies of their respective sovereigns. So the major lesson here, you guys, is as we grow as competitors in the international economy, we will have increased tension between us and the countries around us and in our vicinity that want to compete with us. Now that comes with problems, right? So the problems that will come from the growing tension between us and surrounding countries over economic success and trade look as followed. Publius says, Spain thinks it convenient to shut the Mississippi against us on one side, and Britain excludes us from the St. Lawrence on the other. He's talking about the rivers. Nor will either of them permit the other waters, which are between them and us, to come between the means of mutual intercourse and traffic. From these and such like considerations, which might, if consistent with prudence, be more amplified and detailed, it is easy to see that jealousies and uneasiness may gradually slide into the minds and cabinets of other nations, and that we are not to expect that they should regard our advancement in union, in power, and in consequence by land and sea, with an eye of indifference and composure. So he's providing examples of how these situations, as America's growing as a competitor, are already leading to some issues between the United States and the countries surrounding it, specifically Spain and Britain, who are impacting America's ability to access the Mississippi and St. Lawrence rivers. So what he's saying is they are not thrilled that we are continuing to grow. They're already affecting us. But here's where I find it a little interesting. We're seeing the back and forth between the Anti-Federalists and the Federalists. So Publius, John Jay, is saying we need the Union because right now we have other countries trying to impact us and affect our ability to use the waters that are touching our nation, the Mississippi, the St. Lawrence. He uses it as an example for why we need a federal government to advocate on the behalf of our ability to trade on these. But then I read Patrick Henry in Anti-Federalist paper number 4. Guess what he said? Pretty much the exact opposite. He says, quote, "I will not repeat what the gentlemen, the Federalists, say. I will mention one thing." He's quite sassy. "There is a dispute between us and the Spaniards about the right of navigating the Mississippi. 7 states wished to relinquish this river to them. The 6 southern states opposed it, so the states of the north were in favor of relinquishing the Mississippi River to Spain. 7 states not being sufficient to convey it away, it remains now ours. There is no danger of dismemberment of our country unless a constitution be adopted, which will enable the government to plant enemies on our backs," is what he says. The federal government could plant enemies on our backs. "By the Confederation, the rights of territory are secured. No treaty can be made without the consent of 9 states. 9 states. While the consent of 9 states is necessary to the cession of territory, you are safe. If it be put in the power of a less number, which it would be under the Constitution, you will most infallibly lose the Mississippi. As long as we can preserve our unalienable rights, we are in safety. This new constitution will involve in its operation the loss of the navigation of that valuable river." Interesting. So he goes on to say, regarding our debt with France, which was another concern of the Federalists, they were saying that, France wants a debt paid by us. We'd be stronger in negotiating with France if we had our federal government. Patrick Henry, in Anti-Federalist paper number 4, he replies and he says, "Give me leave to say that Europe is too much engaged about objects of greater importance to attend to us. On that great theater of the world, the little American matters vanish." How fascinating is that? I mean, we were a tiny little thing back then. I get that. We had just won a Revolutionary War, but look at us now. And so this is where I do disagree with Patrick Henry on this, because I think our federal government, the creation of it, allowed us to join the world stage. And I do not think we would have if we remained the separated states or became, some other form of small little confederacies. Now, Patrick Henry goes on to say, "Do you believe that the mighty monarch of France, beholding the greatest scenes that ever engaged the attention of a prince of that country, will divert himself from those important objects and now call for a settlement of accounts with America?" And so he's basically saying, you guys are worried that these foreign guys over in Europe are going to bother us. They have their own problems, and we're these little small, tiny people compared to them. They aren't going to worry about us. Don't worry about it. And I think that might have been a little naive. I mean, we were up and rising on the world stage, and I think we would have had some problems. But it's interesting to see what they were bickering about back then, debating back then. And again, that was in Anti-Federalist paper number 4. I encourage you both to read both. I encourage you all to read both. Now, let's move on to the next topic. So, how can we handle the tension and issues caused by competition with other countries in a better way? Anti-Federalists say we don't need to handle it in a better way. We're already able to handle it. Look at this situation with the Mississippi River. And when it comes to the countries in Europe, they don't really care about us. We're too small. John Jay, as Publius, he makes the case that we are able to handle this competition. We're able to handle these growing tensions way better as a strong and united union. He goes to say, quote, "The people of America are aware that inducements to war may arise out of these circumstances, the economic competition, the growing ability for America to compete on the world stage." He says, as well as for others, not so obvious at this present, that whenever such inducements may find fit time and opportunity for operation, pretenses to color and justify them will not be wanting. Basically he's saying, putting it more simply, there is tension, okay? And this could lead to war at some point, and other similar issues to trade and economic competition could spark the same problem of war. And to assume that our competitors could not easily become our potential enemies of wars is very naive. So we have to keep an eye on that, because if they find justification to start attacking us, they probably will. History's proven people will go to war over very frivolous things, even just disagreements with trade. Publius says then, "Wisely, therefore, do they consider union and a good national government as necessary to put and keep them in such a situation as, instead of inviting war, will tend to repress and discourage it. That situation consists in the best possible state of defense and necessarily depends on the government, the arms, and the resources of a country." Again, put more simply, it would be the most wise decision for us to handle this as a united nation instead of separate small confederacies that are left to fend for ourselves in this competitive economy that could turn violent if handled poorly, or if we were trying to handle this as a disunited and weak country from that weakened position. Okay, so the next topic, moving on, we're going to talk about why one united, larger government is better for us to be able to handle these conflicts versus a bunch of smaller confederacies or states handling them on their own. We're going to read what Publius says. He says, "As the safety of the whole is the interest of the whole, and cannot be provided for without government, either one or more or many, let us inquire whether one good government is not, relative to the object in question, more competent than any other given number whatever. One government can collect and avail itself to the talents and experience of the ablest men, in whatever part of the Union they may be found. It can move on uniform principles of policy. It can harmonize, assimilate, and protect the several parts and members, and extend the benefit of its foresight and precautions to each. In the formation of treaties, it will regard the interest of the whole and the particular interests of the parts as connected with that of the whole. It can apply the resources and power of the whole to the defense of any particular part, and that more easily and expeditiously than state governments or separate confederacies can possibly do, for want of concert and unity of system. It can place the militia under one plan of discipline, and by putting their officers in a more proper line of subordination to the chief magistrate, will in a manner consolidate them into one corps, and thereby render them more efficient than if divided into 13 or into 3 or 4 distinct independent bodies. So basically what he's doing is he's listing off the benefits of what would happen when we're trying to handle foreign conflicts if we came together as a union. He lists off, as a large union, we have more potential for great minds from all over the country to lead us. We have more opportunity, a larger population. He says there will be uniformity in policy, particularly with foreign affairs. It will encourage harmony and cooperation for greatest potential success on our end. It'll give us a stronger seat at the table for making treaties. And not only that, but national resources can be applied and dispersed throughout the country when necessary, instead of a bunch of little states left to fend for themselves against these greater world powers. And then on top of that, he says if necessary, we can coordinate the militia for protection of the nation. Moving on. This is where it gets fun. He gives a good case study, you guys, and this is where history nerd Morgan comes out. So next up, Publius starts to say, what would the militia of Britain be if the English militia obeyed the government of England, if the Scotch militia obeyed the government of Scotland, and if the Welsh militia obeyed the government of Wales? Suppose an invasion. Would those 3 governments, if they agreed at all, be able, with all their respective forces, to operate against the enemy so effectively as the single government of Great Britain would? We have heard much of the fleets of Britain, and the time may come, if we are wise, when the fleets of America may engage attention. But if one national government had not so regulated the navigation of Britain as to make it a nursery for seamen, if one national government had not called forth all the national means and materials for forming fleets, their prowess and their thunder would never have been celebrated. Let England have its navigation and fleet. Let Scotland have its navigation and fleet. Let Wales have its navigation and fleet. Let Ireland have its navigation and fleet. Let those 4 of the constituent parts of the British Empire be under 4 independent governments, and it is easy to perceive how soon they would each dwindle into comparative insignificance. Ooh. Apply these facts to our own case. Leave America divided into 13, or if you please, into 3 or 4 independent governments. What armies could they raise and pay? What fleets could they ever hope to have? If one was attacked, would the others fly to its succor and spend their blood and money in its defense? Would there be no danger of their being flattered into neutrality by specious promises, or seduced by a too great fondness for peace to decline hazarding their tranquility and present safety for the sake of neighbors, of whom perhaps they have been jealous, or whose importance they are content to see diminished? Although such conduct would not be wise, it would nevertheless be natural, because the states would not be working in coordination. They would be competing against each other. There would be different factions in each of the states under a disunited America. Although such conduct would not be wise, it would nevertheless be natural. The history of the states of Greece and of other countries abounds with such instances, and it is not improbable that what has so often happened would, under similar circumstances, happen again. He's basically saying, look at history, learn from history, look what would happen if we remained a disunited America. We must unite and have a federal government in order for us to be safe from attack and from foreign influence. So then Publius says, but admit that they might be willing to help the invaded state or confederacy. How and when and in what proportion shall aids of men and money be afforded? Who shall command the allied armies, and from which of them shall he receive his orders? Who shall settle the terms of peace, and in case of disputes, what umpire shall decide between them and compel acquiescence? Various difficulties and inconveniences would be inseparable from such a situation, whereas one government, watching over the general and common interests and combining and directing the powers and resources of the whole, would be free from all of these embarrassments and conduce far more to the safety of the people. Now, what I find interesting here is, again, what the Anti-federalists say compared to what Publius, John Jay, and the Federalists are saying in each paper number 4. So the Federalists are saying, this makes a lot of sense because when we work together, when we coordinate resources, when we coordinate men, when we coordinate ambition and goals and policy style, we're going to be a safer place. And we're going to, not only that, we're going to be able to compete on the world stage and protect ourselves with strength in numbers and a strong presence just there at the table to potentially negotiate. But the Anti-federalists, Patrick Henry says, consider what you are about to do before you part with the government. This is the end of his paper. Take longer time in reckoning things. Revolutions like this have happened in almost every country in Europe. Similar examples are to be found in ancient Greece and ancient Rome. Instances of the people losing their liberty by their own carelessness and the ambition of a few. We are cautioned against faction and turbulence. I acknowledge that licentiousness is dangerous and that it ought to be provided against. I acknowledge also the new form of government may effectively prevent it. Yet there is another thing it will as effectually do. It will oppress and ruin the people. So that's how the Anti-federalist paper number 4 finishes. Here is how the Federalists finish up their argument. John Jay says, but whatever may be our situation, whether firmly united under one national government or split into a number of confederacies, certainly it is that foreign nations will know and view it exactly as it is, and they will act towards us accordingly. If they see that our national government is efficient and well administered, our trade prudently regulated, our militia properly organized and disciplined, our resources and finances discreetly managed, our credit reestablished, our people free, contented and united, they will be much more disposed to cultivate our friendship than provoke our resentment. If, on the other hand, they find us either destitute of an effectual government, each state doing right or wrong as to its rulers may seem convenient, or split into 3 or 4 independent and probably discordant republics or confederacies, one inclining to Britain, another to France, and a third to Spain, and perhaps played off against each other by the 3, what a poor, pitiful figure will America make in their eyes. How liable will she become, not only to their contempt, but to their outrage? And how soon would dear-bought experience proclaim that when a people or family so divide, it never fails to be against themselves? Signed off by Publius. Now, what he's saying there, you guys, is whatever we eventually choose to become, whether we want to adopt the U.S. Constitution, ratify it or not, if we want to be confederacies, if we want to be a bunch of little states, or if we want to become a united union that coordinates the states working together, our enemies are going to evaluate us and then treat us accordingly based on what they are seeing. And right now, if we look at this situation with our growing competition on the world stage, we have the potential to be world leaders. We have the potential to compete with these people from Europe, with Spain, with everybody that's in this area. Or we have the potential to what? Divide even further, become these weakened individual states or confederacies that don't work together and have more conflict. Our enemies are going to judge us based on that and then treat us accordingly. So I have some thoughts on this paper. I think a big frustration that I have when I read the Federalist Papers, the founders look back on these and they say that these are the greatest political documents. I think even one of them, Thomas Jefferson, described the Federalist, which is the book where all of the Federalist Papers were combined and published. He described this as the best commentary on the principles of government which was ever written. And I agree with that so much. But what's really important for us to understand is that our founders weren't perfect. The Federalists weren't perfect. They may have won the ratification debate, but I see so many different situations where they could potentially be challenged today, and circumstances change. I see so many ways where they are so right, even today in 2021. And then I see some others where it's not that our Federalist founders were wrong. It's that I think our current political leaders have abandoned these concepts. And so when you look back through what we just talked about, you guys, if we were smarter to unite as one country, a united America with our states combining our resources to protect us from potential dangers, then what the heck is going on right now when you look at something like our southern border? Isn't that where we're supposed to be combining our resources as one united nation, where our federal government is supposed to be protecting us from a foreign danger, where our border is being invaded? They're supposed to combine our resources, and we have our best leaders in America, right? That's what our federal government is supposed to be, according to paper number 4. Where are those resources? Why is our government failing us? And I want to talk to you guys about this first. So I suggest that you buy Charles Kessler's version of the Federalist Papers. And it's because what he says is, Publius presented the Constitution as an achievement in good government, a plan worthy not only of momentary applause, but of the rational and enduring consent of an enlightened public. And so if we do a little case study for ourselves and we say, okay, so we have this situation where our federal government is supposed to be coordinating and putting resources down at something like our southern border to protect us from a foreign influence, from a dangerous situation, protecting our citizens. How come that's not happening? I wouldn't say that it is that our Federalists were wrong. I wouldn't say that our Constitution is failing us. I would say that our leaders have abandoned the principles of the Constitution. And when you read what Charles Kessler says, and he says, our founding documents are basically intending for our government to be a representation of the people. So our people are the United States of America. We are the government, and then we choose who we want to elect us. But what if our people lack such basic information and education because of our failing public schools on government, on civics, on history, that then we elect leaders that have no respect for the Constitution? It's because we're no longer an enlightened public, like Charles Kessler says is needed for the Constitution to survive. We're not an enlightened public, and so we can't rationally and enduringly consent to the principles of the Constitution, and then we go and we elect leaders that don't have respect for these core values. And that's on both sides, okay? And so what we need to focus on here is, first of all, making sure that we're electing people and we're putting people into positions of power that understand our founding documents. And again, that's on both sides, just people that have basic respect for the amazing document that is the U.S. Constitution. I believe Charlie Kirk, the founder of Turning Point USA, says it's the best political document ever written. So, when we see failures like at the border, it's more of a problem of what's going on with American people. Why are we lacking? Honestly, I think we're physically weak, mentally weak, spiritually weak, and morally weak. And that's why we have leaders now that fail us and abandon these documents. I would also say, though, I hear a lot of people that say, I'm getting sick of this government. I'm getting sick of America. Let's just secede, okay? We want Texas to leave. Texas will go be its own country. I hear people say California should go out and just be detached from our country as well. Think of it, I know I want to get rid of California a lot too, but when you put it out there like that, think of it like this. Imagine California as its own country. How much easier would it be to invade California as its own country than it would be to invade one of the states in the United States of America, even if it is crappy California? It'd be a lot easier. And by that I mean imagine communist China invading California, getting on American soil. Getting on the soil of the West. Can you imagine that? Same thing with Texas. Imagine Texas. It's filled with great cowboys. I used to live in Texas. I have a house in Texas. But imagine it being on its own and then being invaded by one of our enemies. We are much stronger. As much as we want to kick California out a lot, we're much stronger when we are united. Our Constitution's not failing us. I say this a lot in speeches, but I'm a big Esther 4:14 girl. So people usually use that, and I think they overuse it. But they say that, we were all made for such a time as this. And I think our Constitution was made for such a time as this. It's not failing us, it's being abandoned by our leaders. And so the more we can understand that, I think we're going to be in a stronger position to move forward and understand that we have a lot of enemies these days. And when we are dealing with that, we're much stronger as 50 United States than we would be as an individual Texas, an individual California, whatever it may be. So understand that moving forward. This isn't just an archaic concept that we're talking about. We have to understand the historic principles in order to protect ourselves now and move forward. Because I think our founders were genius. Whether they were anti-federalists or federalists, they had these amazing concepts that built up the West, that built up American society. And they might have bickered it out, but they got forward and they moved forward together. That being said, moving forward for us, how are we all going to act? I said it a little bit ago. Our government is a representation of the people of America, and I believe that strong individuals lead to strong families, lead to strong communities, lead to a strong country. And so the first thing, if you want to do something immediately today, first of all, buy a copy of the Federalist and Anti-Federalist Papers and be listening to this podcast. Remember to post a picture of it and do hashtag Freedom Papers once you get it online and tag me, because we have an Instagram page now. But also, going back to my little equation, the beginning of that, of achieving a strong America, starts with achieving a strong individual. So the best thing you can do is work on bettering yourself, not only with listening to the Federalist Papers, not only listening to Freedom Papers, not only reading our founding documents, but bettering yourself physically, mentally, spiritually, and morally, so that we can start getting people who are like us back into office, leading our country and respecting the founding documents as they make big decisions that impact us domestically and on a world stage. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. Thank you to Turning Point USA for giving me the opportunity to do this. I hear a lot of students on college campuses are meeting and watching these episodes, so thank you guys for doing this. I hear charter school teachers, homeschool teachers, moms and dads are watching these with their kids, and I hear the teachers in their classrooms in public school are watching these as well. So thank you so much for doing that. I really appreciate it, you guys, and thank you again to Turning Point and all of our supporters. We love providing this educational resource to everyone. I'll see you next week.